on DAB digital radio and 1089 and 1053 AM. The Week with George Galloway on Talk Sport.
It's Friday. It's 10. It has to be The Week with me, George Galloway. And that means it has to be Talk Sport, because we are the Sony Academy radio station of the year. And this is the University of the Airwaves. This is the home of legends. And we talk where others fear to tread. We've got teachers' union leaders. We've got the sharpest writer in the English language today, Matthew Norman, on Jeremy Clarkson, that boiling, broiling vat of past water. We've got John Cross, the Daily Mirror football writer, on the Euro 2012 draw. I mean, as Oscar Wilde said on the death scene on Little Nell, the sight of Fabio explaining how come he's based in the wrong country is really something for me. It made me laugh, as does Kate Smurthwaite, Britain's funniest woman, comedian and feminist. And boy, is she a feminist. Girl, is she a feminist. And she's got some sharp words for the BBC about the sports personality of the year, which is an all-testosterone affair. And who better to explain the rise and rise of Newt, the possibility of President Newt. Newt Gingrich is on the rise as the others fall by the wayside, felled by those old familiar stories of sexual shenanigans. It's now Newt versus Mitt. I mean, really, you couldn't make it up. John Le Boutillier, former Republican congressman, bringing up, if you'll forgive me, the rear on The Week on Talk Sport, Sony Academy radio station of the year.
The Week with George Galloway on Talk Sport.
And this is the anniversary of Nick Leeson going to jail. Seems to me there are people who've done much worse. Let me know if there's anyone you think should be in jail. No, I probably can't read them out. My producer is shaking her head. Natalie is a very strict lady, and she's made it clear that I have to cancel that last announcement. Don't let me know who you think should be in jail, because for the most part, that would probably be defamatory. I'll think of something else to ask you to tell me in the course of the next 3 hours. I do, of course, need a song to play out with. If you've got any suggestions on that, you can text them to me on 81089 for 50 pence plus normal sending charges, or you can write them or anything else free of charge through the website at talksport.co.uk. But above all, I need your telephone calls on 08717 22 3344. If you have a point of view which is different to mine, you're virtually guaranteed to be on the air. If you're a woman caller, a first-time caller, you'll definitely be prioritised, but all calls are, of course, welcome. Well, that was the week. That was, wasn't it? Millions of people out on strike, thousands of them out on the march, but the media treatment of the story of rage and anguish from some of the poorest paid people in the land out trying to defend their pensions. Do you know that within a few years, according to this government's new policy, a firefighter must work till he's 67? Now, that's bad news for the firefighter, but it's also bad news for you. Can you imagine being up the burning staircase at the top of the burning building, waiting for the 67-year-old firefighter to reach you? Are we really that poor as a country? Because if we are, I have a long list of things that it would be better to dispense with than the retirement age for firefighters and dinner ladies and classroom assistants and school teachers and health service workers and all the others who made up the millions of people who went out on strike and lost their day's pay to show their anguish at the theft of their pensions and their retirement by this government of millionaires. But in the interests of accuracy, I must point out that only 18 of the 22 members of the British Cabinet are millionaires. 4 of them are less than millionaires, and we should really bow our heads at the pity of that. But 18 of them will never have to worry about their retirement. The only thing we have to worry about, in my opinion, is to make sure they retire rather quicker than they probably currently have in mind. And if there was anything more grotesque than a front bench of toffs, Lord Snooties to a man, sneering down their aquiline noses at dinner ladies on strike over their £5,000 a year pensions, which they've already paid for, it has to be the grotesque spectacle of that vat of vile bile called Jeremy Clarkson, a public sector worker par excellence, paid for by a compulsory license fee for which we'll go to prison if we don't pay, opining at 7 p.m. in the evening in front of the children of millions of people who had just been on strike that he thought their parents should be taken outside and executed in front of them. And they say it was a joke. A joke. Well, I could think of lots of jokes of equally dubious taste that if I were to now deliver to the nation, this would be my last show. Think of all the broadcasters, here and elsewhere, whose services have been dispensed with for far, far less than that. You know, if someone had suggested on a 7 p.m. BBC show that the government, cabinet ministers, the millionaires, should be similarly treated, do you think they'd be back on the BBC the next week? Still less picking up a salary north of £1 million a year. Who better to give us his, no doubt acid, but much funnier view of that than Matthew Norman, who I see, it's reported here, is a Telegraph columnist, and I had thought he was with the Independent. Well, he may be slumming it in the Telegraph now, but he's Britain's funniest and sharpest writer. And we've got John Cross, the Daily Mirror football writer, on the Euro 2012 draw. Kate Smuthwaite, stand-up comedian and stand-up girl, on the BBC Sportsperson of the Year. And coming up, excuse me, at the end, John Le Boutillier, the Newsmax columnist and former Republican congressman, on the rise and rise of Newt Gingrich. Union leaders have restarted discussions with government departments after Wednesday's strike. The talks over public sector pension plans by the government are aimed at avoiding any further industrial action, it says here. The walkouts were branded a damp squib by David Cameron. Some squib, some damp. Chief Secretary to the Treasury, otherwise known as the Ginger Rodent, Danny Alexander, says the talks are important.
It's the right thing to do, both for the government and for the trade unions, to carry on discussions about pensions, which was going on before the strikes, which we'd all previously agreed would carry on after the strikes. It's why the timing of the strikes was so odd and so damaging.
Well, there you go. Nowadays, at least, for a little light relief, miniskirts are allowed in the House of Commons. and you don't have to be a woman to wear one. But in 1966, I kid you not, in 1966, the miniskirt was banned from the Houses of Parliament at Westminster. My goodness, who'd have thought it? Now, the teachers were amongst many who were on strike on Wednesday. Millions of people, having been properly balloted under the Tory government's anti-union laws, voted in overwhelming majorities to withdraw their labour for a day, and my goodness, you'd have thought that they had committed some kind of offence. Of course, one of the things that these strikes achieve is that people get to realise just how important the work done by the people now on strike actually is. You see, if Jeremy Clarkson went on strike, it would matter not a jot. If the teenage scribblers in the gutter press heaping opprobrium on these public sector workers and their allegedly guilt-edged pensions, if they went on strike, nobody would notice. If the politicians, for the most part, went on strike, nobody would notice. But if your teacher, who's the person in whose hands for 7 hours or so a day your most precious possession is in the hands of your children, your children's future, their education is in the hands of school teachers who ought to be respected and admired and cherished. If even head teachers decide, as they did, that they would strike, well, you'd think any sane person would stop and think something must be wrong here. Teachers, you see, as I had cause to find out this very week, in matters too personal to share on the airwaves, but the headmistress in question knows who she is. Teachers are not militant people. Teachers are not wreckers or saboteurs. If they were, they wouldn't be standing in front of our children, often in difficult situations, in order to try and fashion a new generation of people in Britain that will take our country forward. Now, the Deputy General Secretary of the ATL, that's the Association of Teachers and Lecturers, has agreed to join us this evening. He's Martin Johnson, and he's very welcome. Martin, thanks for joining the show.
Hello, George. Nice to be with you.
Thanks. Now, just tell us, just recap, if you would, for any listeners who've just got out of prison and are behind the curve. What is it that the government are trying to do to teachers and other public sector workers that they found so objectionable?
Well, it all started about a year ago, George, when the Chancellor, in his previous autumn statement, announced that public sector pensions were far too generous and that all public sector workers were going to have to work longer, pay more, but get less in their pensions. Now,
you don't need to be a teacher to work out that's a pretty bad offer.
Well, that's right. I mean, but the government said, of course, and I think many of your listeners will think, well, yes, but everybody's living longer and the country's in a bad financial way, so but surely things have to change. What they didn't realise is that in 2007, just 4 years ago, we brought in changes to all of the pension schemes exactly because we knew that people were living longer, and therefore we had to adjust how much teachers, in the case of my members, how much teachers were putting into the scheme, so that when they retired, the government ought to be able to afford to pay them the decent pension. So we changed the scheme in a lot of ways. And as a result of those changes, the various of these agencies which do all these sums worked out last year that over the next 50 years, the cost of pensions, of public sector pensions, is going to go down by about 25%. That's with the changes we agreed a few years ago. That's why our members, who we've told all of the time for the last year exactly what the situation is, they of course have been interested to follow this. They can't see why, if the government doesn't put forward any justification, any sums, if you like, going forward. The government keeps saying, oh, the country can't afford it, oh, it's unsustainable, but they've never produced any figures to back that up. And, as I say, various agencies like the National Audit Commission and so on say, no, the cost of pensions is going down. That's why they are unprecedentedly angry.
Yeah, I mean, and all sorts of teachers of all grades walked out and took democratic decisions to walk out, as I say, a symptom of just how far that anger has gone. Now, one of the tactics of those who wish to force public sector workers down this alley has been to try and set private sector workers at the throats of public sector workers, a divide and rule tactic which for me has been brazenly obvious, but some, alas, have fallen for it. What would your argument be to the private sector workers working and probably not got a pension scheme like yours? What would your argument be to them?
Well, I have to say, George, this is one aspect of this problem that makes me really angry. You know, and I know, and many of your listeners know, that if you work in the private sector, you're very unlikely to have a decent occupational pension at all. Many workers have seen their pension funds disappear. Some by pure theft from employers, and others through mismanagement over the last 20 years or so. And so many workers in the private sector have got no occupation or pension at all, or a very small one to look forward to. So what's the result of that going to be? We all know that the state pension is currently a long way below the poverty line. And if you haven't got an occupational pension, that means that you're going to have to rely on state means-tested benefits throughout your old age. Now, we're one of the richest. I know we've got problems at the moment, but we're one of the richest countries in the world. And is the government seriously telling the British people that although we're one of the richest countries, we can't expect all of our people to have a dignified retirement with a pension income above the poverty line? It doesn't. It just makes me mad. And the point, of course, is that reducing public sector pensions won't do anything to help the shop assistant.
It won't put a potato on anybody else's plate.
Absolutely.
I mean,
why drag everybody down to that level?
A race to the bottom.
Absolutely.
Last point, Martin. How did you feel when you saw the multi-millionaire Jeremy Clarkson say that your members should really be taken out and executed in front of their families?
Well, to be honest, George, I mean, we all know Jeremy Clarkson. I just shrugged my shoulders. Personally, it didn't annoy me because that's Jeremy. I don't watch his programs very much. He's not my cup of tea.
You are paying his wages. You are paying his wages.
I know, that's right. And some people find him funny and others find him very unfunny. I find him unfunny myself, but that's just Jeremy. Let's not worry about that. That's a sideshow, actually, George. What is the important thing is the government going to listen to a huge number of people? And I took part in a march on Wednesday, along with millions of others. And there were actually 1,000 events in towns big and small across the country. And all the reports I'm getting is that each and every one of those marches was clapped by the people who were watching them in our high streets up and down the country. The government knows that what it's doing is not popular. It hasn't won the media war, if you like, and it's going to have to really think seriously about coming back to us. From the point of view of ATL, and indeed my members, who, as you say, hate having to go on strike, all they want is for the government to come back with an offer which represents a bit of give and take. And I hope that Wednesday will have convinced the government, yes, we need to give more, we need to negotiate properly, and we need to do a deal that is a sensible compromise for all concerned.
Martin Johnson, Deputy General Secretary of the Association of Teachers and Lecturers on the strikes midweek. Tell me what you think. 08717 223344. During Gideon Osborne's 47-minute autumn statement, the multi-millionaire Chancellor of the Exchequer conceded that by the time of the next election, he'll need to raise more than double the amount he predicted only 8 months ago.
Our debt challenge is even greater than we thought because the boom was even bigger, the bust even deeper, and the effects will last even longer.
So there you have it. We're going through all this to reduce the debt, but actually the debt is going to massively increase. The only point is we'll be giving it away in benefits to the millions of unemployed rather than investing it in jobs so that the unemployed don't need to get any benefits so that they can pay us taxes instead. Well, don't get me started. Anyway, here's some texts and emails. Kevin in Plymouth says, with his ignorant remarks, Clarkson has done more to make the case against austerity seem reasonable than anyone on the left ever could. We should thank him. And Des says, George, Clarkson is vile, on that we agree. However, you talk arrogantly as if you would run this country to financial security. I would. Furthermore, I find it strange that the financial circumstance of the cabinet is relevant. I do not want to see anyone lose out, but right now, virtually everyone is struggling. I'm certain that neither Cameroon nor his crowd want to be hated, but they are making tough and difficult decisions for the best possible safety of our nation. Well, not everyone's struggling, you see, Des. We're not all in this together. 18 of 22 of the people making these tough decisions are themselves millionaires. We're not in it together with them. They don't live the same lives as you, Des. The tough decisions they're making are tough for you, but not for them. Can't you see? Don't you know that in Sloane Street in London I saw a gent's suit in the window? This is a first for me. I didn't even know the £1,000 suit had arrived. In the window of Dolce & Gabbana in Sloane Street in London, there's a really ordinary-looking suit at a cost of £2,073. You see, we're not all in this together. As Ed Miliband attempted to say, but predictably fluffed his lines, the dinner lady earns in a year what Gideon Osborne spent on his skiing holiday for a week. We're not all in this together. Billy T. in Widnes says, a man is judged by the company he keeps. Clarkson's mates with Dave Cameron. Dave Cameron's mates with Andy Coulson. Need I say more? Very well said, Billy. Joe in Croydon says, George, I totally agree with you. Healthcare and education are the base of our society, and in Britain we have some of the best public sector workers in the world. We must protect those who ensure the safety, health and education of our teachers, nurses and doctors. Not only do they do a great job, but they're also incredibly skilled individuals with an amazing set of abilities. My mother is a head teacher, and there is a saying she likes to use, children are born with wings, teachers make them fly. Very well said. Now, let's take the first caller, shall we? John in Telford.
Hello,
John,
George.
welcome to the show, my friend.
I've been around much lately, old age. I'd like to think, George, that you bring the passion I once had. It's wonderful to listen to you.
Well, we'll all pass that passion on like a baton to the next generation,
right, George.
John.
Well, George, I was lucky to be born in 1935 when we had, as a result of the war, a Labour government which set us on the way to some decency, some sense of social identity.
And the country was a lot poorer then
and it was a
than
lot
it is
poorer,
now.
George. But you know the kind of men who drove us on at that time.
Yes.
Now, what we've got now is you've already spoken with the gentleman from the Teachers' Union has spoken about it too. How is it, George, and I'll keep it to just one question because there's so many people queuing up. I'd like to talk to you all night. But how is it, George, that the ruling class in this country can continually divide us in the way they've done? Is there an education, I ask? Why is it? It just blows my mind. And I'm tended to be reminded of the great Eugene O'Neill's play, The Iceman Cometh.
Oh, great.
Oh, George, yes. Oh, great. When I saw that great actor play it in his last, just before he died, Robert Ryan played Larry Slade, the old anarchist.
Yeah.
What can you do with the human clay? How can you mold a civilization with this ignorance that we have? I said enough, George.
No, actually, you said it all, John, and it's great to hear your voice again. Don't be a stranger. Look, Abraham Lincoln famously said, "You can fool all of the people some of the time, and you can fool some of the people all of the time." What he didn't say was that you can fool enough of the people enough of the time to continue to make hay while the rest toil. And that's really what we have. As this radio show certainly proves, and has done now for 6 years, there are people in every part of this land who can see things very clearly. But as this radio show, and particularly other radio shows and the readership of the gutter newspapers and so on, there are a lot of people who are misled and easily divided, one from the other, black from white, men from women, public sector from private sector, people of foreign background from people of so-called indigenous background and so on. These people are fools. They're being fooled. The rulers, the people who are buying the £2,000 suits and parking their Lamborghinis on the double yellow line in Sloane Street while they nip in and buy it because they've got a chauffeur who's driving them, they're throwing sand in enough people's eyes to get them by, to keep the system going that they so benefit from, but few others do. But it won't always be that way. Times will change. Now, here's Adam in Weston-super-Mare. Go ahead,
Hello,
Adam.
George. Hello, George. How are you? Big fan of yours.
Thanks,
Love
mate.
yours, mate.
Thank you, pal.
Hey, always admire your comments and big fan of your show.
Thanks.
Yeah. George, what I'd say actually at the moment is I'm sure, like a lot of people around the country, I'm really quite actually unhappy with these civil servants. They're getting pensions, they're 40 grand a year, whatever they're getting.
Well, there's not many civil servants getting 40 grand a year, Adam.
Well, there is down here in Weston-super-Mare, but
No,
anyway.
well, doing what? Which jobs get 40 grand a year?
Well, I'd like to start as I mean to go on if you don't mind. But you get like the indexing pensions, your work and everything. They treat service like businesses and business like services. There are so many people struggling at the moment when it comes to the self-employed and everything else. And I do appreciate the tea lady and the cleaners and all that lot. It's not fair at the moment. This is a problem for all governments, up and down. And I'll tell you what, I'm so... A lot of this comes from Europe, George. As you well know, there's a lot of EU diktats. They've got the minimum wage, and it's put people now. We have working tax credits. We should never have had all this. We should be paid for what we're worth.
Adam, I don't believe that you listen to my radio and TV shows, because if you
I do indeed.
If you did, you wouldn't be so stupid. You wouldn't have fallen. You wouldn't have fallen for this guff. Europe's got a lot to do with it. What? Got a lot to do with what? that a dinner lady gets £4,300 a year pension when she retires at 65. Europe's got a lot to do with that. Well, actually it doesn't, but if it did...
Servant, George,
but if it did...
civil servant.
Well, you started out, Adam, by saying that civil servants...
George.
Adam, you started out saying that civil servants in Weston-super-Mare earn 40 grand a year. Well,
they get their money
everywhere. Look, don't just keep shouting.
I'm
telling you that there are virtually no civil servants earn 40 grand a year. The only civil servants who would earn 40 grand a year are the very top executives in the civil service.
And what do they say? They say
but,
no.
Adam, there's hundreds of thousands of civil servants, most of them earning less than half of what you're saying that they earn. And this idiotic sun speak, it's down to Europe. It's Europe that's... please, you're putting my blood pressure up. Here's Alan in Norfolk. Go ahead, Alan.
Hello, Jules. Nice to speak to you again, the old son, yeah.
And you,
I'll tell you what, mate. What they want to do with Clarkson, etc., is chuck them in the chicken run over at West Ham on a Saturday afternoon, and we'll see what's left of them. All right? And
That's an imaginative solution.
Here, George. I was a doctor in East London in the 60s, my friend.
Yep.
And we went out on strike to back the Whitechapel nurses.
Yes.
That's what that strike was all about.
Yep.
It worked out of the unions, and we got finished off when the old containers come in, and we all given our heavy goods licences, and we've all got these truckers' jobs, etc., etc. Mr. I think Heath at the time paid Jack Dashoff 63 grand to get rid of him. Scargill was paid off. And in 3 centuries, I think that people are wising up now. What they ought to do, I blame the people of this country. They should all go to the ballot box, and then we'll see what government gets in. At the end of the day, George, my friend, you're my role model, and I hope I'm your role model.
No, you're
what
great.
we ought to do is get your friend there, mate, from Cuba, and get him over here and get him to run the country.
Now you're talking, Alan. Actually, on this day, in 1976, my friend in Cuba became the president of Cuba. How's that for a fact? Plucked, apparently, out of thin air, but actually given to me by the lovely Natalie, who's strict but lovely. Alan, great call. Great to hear from you again. Let me squeeze in Alan in Rickmansworth. Alan, welcome.
Good evening. You've already touched on the pensions in the private sector.
Yeah.
And don't forget the old government dipped into the pension funds for the tune of $5 billion. Yeah. And they're going to put that every year into the future. That's money that's been taken out of the profits that should go to pay for the members.
Yeah, instead it went to pay for schools and hospitals, of course.
Yeah, well, that's what they say it did. But, of course, it didn't. It went on armaments and other infrastructure.
Some of it did, yeah, you're right, Alan.
And then the other thing is when, allegedly, Mr. Maxwell stole the...
Well, you don't need to say allegedly. He's dead, and he definitely did it.
Okay, we can say that he did it then. You know, if you and I broke into a house and stole some stuff, and the police caught us, we'd have the stuff back.
Mm.
Now, all the shares that Mr. Maxwell supposedly stole, they've all got on. It's a public record when you sell them. The banks still have them. Why aren't they given back to them?
Unfortunately, your line's breaking, but it was a very good point that you were making. Robert Maxwell was the greatest thief of the 20th century. Alistair Campbell was, of course, the man who carried his hat and coat and broke a man's nose for making light of Robert Maxwell's demise. He paid for it, of course, bobbing along in the Atlantic Ocean, but we never got our money back. And a lot of decent workers in the Mirror Group, for which I have for some years myself worked, had their pensions stolen. The only scant compensation, Alan, and it's very scant, is that many of those who did Robert Maxwell's bidding, who slandered and smeared those that Maxwell ordered them to slander and smear, discovered after the fat lady sang, so to speak, that the man they'd been serving so loyally had stolen their pension too.
I would take them outside and execute them in front of their families. I mean, how dare they go on strike when they've got these gilt-edged pensions that are going to be guaranteed while the rest of us have to work for a living?
I think they're absolutely disgraceful and disgusting comments. And I think they're outrageous, and Jeremy Clarkson should apologise for those comments, because he obviously doesn't understand the lives of the people who were going out on strike yesterday.
I think it was really horrible and nasty and really very, very extreme, almost inciting anger and hate towards public sector workers who were lawfully going about demonstrating and taking industrial action about something they care about.
Well, it was obviously a silly thing to say, and I'm sure he didn't mean that. I didn't see the remark, but I mean, I'm sure it's a silly thing to say.
Great montage. Thanks very much for that, Natalie. That was Billy Bragg, of course, providing the backdrop to some fairly grisly words from Clarkson and his friend David Cameron. Jeremy Clarkson has apologised for saying public sector workers who went on strike should be executed. The Top Gear presenter made the remarks during an episode of The One Show, prompting more than 21,000 complaints to the BBC. Unison has accepted his apology, whilst I have not, and they have invited him to spend the day with a healthcare assistant on a hospital ward. Now, of course, if this were a rare error of judgment by Mr. Clarkson, that would be one thing, but let me just give you one or two others. In November 2005, Clarkson was rapped after making a mock Nazi salute during a segment in Top Gear about a new Mini. He said that the inbuilt GPS navigation only goes to Poland. German diplomats sternly pointed out that had his salute been on German television, he would have faced criminal charges and even a possible 6-month prison term. The BBC said it would deal with it under the corporation's rigorous complaints procedure. When slating the Perodua Kelisa car as the worst in the world, Clarkson quipped that the Malaysian-manufactured vehicle was built in jungles by people who wear leaves for shoes. And in November 2008, the BBC received hundreds of complaints after Clarkson joked about lorry drivers murdering prostitutes. During an episode of Top Gear, he said, change gear, check mirror, murder a prostitute, change gear, murder. That's a lot of effort in a day. In February 2009, Clarkson, of course, described the Prime Minister as a one-eyed Scottish idiot. And in February 2011, along with his Top Gear colleagues James May and Richard Hammond, now Richard Hammond's a man with a point of view about public sector workers, I should have thought, didn't they save his life or something? Maybe it's time for him to speak out. He described Mexican food as refried sick, and the Mexican people as lazy, feckless and flatulent. They said the Mexican ambassador would not complain, as he was likely to be asleep. And in September 2011, Clarkson angered many of the Welsh population when he called for the Welsh language to be abolished. I could go on, but a better man to talk to about this is the funniest and sharpest writer in the English language today, Matthew Norman of The Independent and another newspaper, which shall be nameless. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Good evening, George.
Now, before we go on to the Clarkson issue, just by chance, I don't know if you heard it, but when I was coming into the studio tonight, Danny was reviewing the sports books of the year and encouraging people to buy the best of them for Christmas presents for sports-mad listeners. Now, you will be glad to know, as I myself had said, that your book was right up there in the top 5.
Well, that's marvellous. Thank you very much. It's in paperback, available for about 12p, I think, on Amazon. So I appreciate the plug, George. Thank you.
No, it's a terrific book, and you couldn't get a better stocking filler. Now, just give us the benefit of your take on Jeremy Clarkson's comments in the week, would you?
Yes, of course. Well, I'm very grateful to him, and I think we all should be, because it takes a special kind of sort of genius half-wit to crystallize a very finely balanced issue as far as public opinion and shift it, I think, perhaps perceptibly towards what you and I, and hopefully many of your listeners will think is the right way to think about it. When a man who lives on the Isle of Man, presumably to avoid paying a lot of tax on his $1 million, $2 million, whatever it is a year he gets from the BBC and
From
other.
the public sector, yeah.
Well, $1 million plus apparently from the public sector. When a man like that talks in such an infantile and witless way about people who earn maybe 15, 17, 20,000 pounds a year, I think it's a good thing. I think it's you know, if you didn't know better, you think he was a Trojan horse for the public sector unions.
Yes. Well, I think that's a very good point, and it's a point that was made in a couple of texts also. But I mean, I find the whole thing disturbing, not least the news that is breaking this evening, at least breaking to me, that in fact it wasn't an off-the-cuff comment at all. It was scripted and agreed by the producer of the one show before the show began.
So far as I'm aware, it was agreed that he would make his side-splitting, hilarious script about shooting strikers, but I think he ad-libbed so far as getting their families to watch the executions. I think that was his own off-the-cuff.
That was the cherry on the cake of the joke.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think obviously there's a sort of visceral horror when a bison-headed half-wit like that comes out with something so cretinous. But I think there's also a danger of, I think you know, one should try not to take it too seriously because that sort of dignifies and inflates him.
No, I think that's true, and maybe I've been guilty of that myself. But I suppose it's the double standard also. You know, if I had said that on the BBC One show, in reverse, if I had said that the cabinet should be taken out and be executed in front of their families, which I never would say and never would wish, but can you, there would be, or if I worked for the BBC, I'm sure I would be sacked for it.
I'm sure you would be frog-marched out of the building without having time to pick up your jacket, no question about that. And there is the kind of deafening double standard whereby the Daily Mail, which sort of flammed up and conflated the silly prank phone call by Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand, went berserk about that, thinks we should all be grown up and just have a good laugh about this.
Yes. I mean, what else would we be told to? If someone had made a joke about executing black people or Jewish people or gay people, would they all have been so po-faced about it as they were about trade unionists being?
No, I mean there are very, very powerful forces of reaction in this country who are dedicated to crushing any kind of public sector action of this kind and anything else which threatens the profitability of multinationals or generally, threatens the exchequer of a Tory government. And they will mobilise themselves. But this makes it harder. That's why I'm grateful to him.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, I on reflection, think that Ross and Brand were treated unfairly, and they certainly were treated unfairly in comparison with how he is being treated and likely to be treated by the BBC.
Well, I mean, that was insanity, wasn't it? I mean, it was silly and childish, not particularly funny. But the idea that someone who'd been in the acting trade for 60 years, like Andrew Sachs, would give a damn, really, when in fact all it did was sort of briefly revive his career, was lunacy. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think that was preposterous. But I think if we're going to try and be consistent, we should at least say that this man, though in many ways utterly repulsive, shouldn't be. I think it's very unlikely he'll be sacked because he's such a huge banker for them. I mean, the sad thing is, I think, that there are millions and millions of people in this country who worship the guy and everything he says and writes.
Yeah, let's hope he doesn't go into politics. God knows how far he'll get. Matthew...
Well, I don't know. Yes, if he does, George, you and I will be on the first plane out.
Matthew, thanks very much. Just give us the name of the book again and the publisher.
The publisher is Fourth Estate. The book is called You Cannot Be Serious, The 101 Most Infuriating Things in Sport.
You cannot be serious. It's a brilliant book, and Danny Kelly and I both think that it's definitely a must for football and sport-loving stockings this Christmas. Thanks very much, Matthew Norman.
On DAB Digital Radio and 1089 and 1053 AM. The Week with George Galloway on Talk Sport.
You're listening to The Week with me, George Galloway, on Talk Sport, the Sony Academy radio station of the year. We've already talked to one of the teaching union leaders, and we've talked to the incomparable Matthew Norman, author, broadcaster, journalist, genius, and we'll be talking to other interesting guests in the course of the next 2 hours. We're talking, of course, about the millions of people who went on strike in the week. Many of them, most of them actually, for the very first time in their entire careers, and including even head teachers. So angry have the workers involved become at the government's attempt to make them pay for an economic crisis in which they had no part of the making. And we're talking about that public sector worker, Jeremy Clarkson, who lives in the Isle of Man, makes millions, directly and indirectly, out of his employ as a public sector worker, which we're forced to pay for by the compulsory license fee, making him a man in a very large glass house who perhaps oughtn't to have been throwing stones. And Richard Hammond, I'd like to hear from. About time he spoke up about the public sector workers who plucked him from a hair's breadth away from doom and demise and restored him to health. Come on, Richard. Be a man. Stand up to Clarkson. Tell us what you think of the public sector workers, your rich friend so disparaged. Be talking about the 2012 draw. And I don't mean to be unkind, because I really actually do wish that England do well, because I like the players, if not some of the supporters. Never been much for football supporters singing about Rule Britannia and ruling the waves and all that. You can imagine that leaves me rather cold, but I do like the players, and I do want them to do well. But I do think it's a bit funny that the manager's already booked them into a hotel 5,000 miles away from where they're going to be playing. John Cross of the Mirror will tell us what he thinks of the draw as a whole. And Kate Smurthwaite, stand-up comedian, all-round stand-up lady, who's also a very feminist writer, will be talking about the extraordinary shortlist for the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, which is an all-testosterone affair. And the great John Le Boutillier, former Republican congressman, on the rise and rise of would-be President Newt. He's only got to dispose of Mitt in order for Newt to be the Republican standard-bearer in the upcoming US presidential election. Yes, it'll soon be that time again. 08717 223344 is the number to call. 81089 is the number to text at 50 pence plus normal sending charges. Or you can write free of charge through the website at talksport.co.uk.
The Week with George Galloway on Talk Sport.
Well, let's fire into some of the calls. Here's Martin in Belfast, who's a striking teacher in the week. Martin, welcome to the show.
Hi, George. How's it going?
Yes, not so bad. What would you like to say?
George, just a couple of quick points. If I can dispense with the Jeremy Clarkson fella first and foremost, he's just an odious lickspittle. And you know what? You mentioned him being a public worker, a public sector worker. David Cameron's also a public sector worker.
That's true.
And he made the statement, I can see a kind of lineage between what he said in the House of Commons about Ed Miliband being left-wing and Clarkson saying this later on in the day on the One Show. Now, it fits in perfectly, I think, to this massive demonisation of working class people, working people right across the UK, no matter what they do. That I just think it fits into that attack that they're making.
That's why I'm angry about Clarkson. It's not because I don't think that people should be allowed to have, views and make jokes and so on, but I believe that he really means that. I believe there's a section of the British population, many of them followers of people like him, others in the EDL and these other extreme right-wing organizations. This is the kind of thoughts that run through their heads.
Absolutely.
That's why I think it was dangerous.
Yeah, and if I was to say on your show right now that I think the British royal family should be taken out, lined up and executed, it would be opprobrium.
Indeed.
If I was someone
well, I would have
it on a show.
if you said that, I'd have to dump it. I'd have to answer for it if it got on the air, and the police would be round at your door, toot sweet.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that.
No, of course.
But if I did, but the other thing is, George, I was out on strike this week for the first time ever, and like many thousands of workers right across hundreds of thousands of people, millions in fact, across the UK. And indeed, don't forget, in Northern Ireland and Ireland in general, this place has gone through economic turmoil. We have no fiscal control in the north. In the south, the sovereignty is basically handed over to the EU, IMF. So this island that we live on is in complete chaos, economic chaos at the minute. So there is hard times falling here. But the reason why I went on strike wasn't just for monetary gain or monetary value or anything like that. I teach in a relatively well-off school. The children are from very plush backgrounds, if I may say so, and I get on very well with most of their parents, many of whom would work in the private sector. Now, just before we went on strike, we had a parents' evening, and nearly every parent who I spoke to said, "Good luck, we are backing you in this." Nearly every one of them. That was last Thursday, the strike was on Wednesday. The parents' evening was last Thursday, the strike was on Wednesday, and the amount of support we got standing outside the school, horns beeping, people bringing us tea and so forth, was amazing, unbelievable. So there
that's very encouraging, very, very encouraging. Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
Was the strike as effective? In Scotland it was 99% of teachers were on strike, or 99% of all schools were closed. It was not the same in England, about getting on for 2/3. Was it what sort of percentage turned out in the north of Ireland, and did it cross what you might call sectarian lines?
Well, there's a difficulty. The strike was widely supported among schools in the Catholic sector. Nearly all of them were closed. In fact, probably all of them were closed. In the state sector, there were a few closed and some partially functioning, but that was because the biggest union, the Ulster Teachers Union, they required a 2/3 majority in their ballot in order for teachers to go out. Now, they got 59.8%, so they nearly reached the 2/3.
Yeah.
And so they didn't go out, but they were fully supportive of the strike, and as we speak, they're changing the rules to that law in their own rules at the minute. But the other thing, George, was I'm really disappointed. Our local politicians, Sinn Féin and the SDLP, came out and backed this. They didn't cross the picket lines. They didn't go to work. Martin McGuinness didn't go to Stormont. Neither did the Education Secretary here, John O'Dowd. They stayed away. The Ulster Unionist Party and the Democratic Unionist Party, and I'm not making a political point here, I'm just saying that they went into work, and that's fair enough. They had sympathy for the strikers. But the Labour Party in Britain, that's what really gets me. I know Miliband stood up and said what he said. We won't support it, but we won't condemn it. That's not a logical position to have.
No, and you get knocked down when you walk down the middle of the road like that by the traffic coming in both directions. Yeah. It would have been better taking a position and sticking to it. He did at least, admittedly, when riled and under taunting from the multimillionaire Prime Minister, he did at least come out with some kind of defence for the public sector workers themselves. But yes, I agree with you, Martin. It was pitiful.
I agree. I think he actually rattled Cameron. I think he did well. He hammered Cameron in the Commons last week. But, it's a much wider thing in my view, George. It's not just about our pensions. Of course it is. That's the issue that we were on strike on. And I went through, as the ATL union rep spoke to you earlier about, I went out in 2007. Before that, we were on strike as well. But we came to that agreement just 4 years ago about this longevity argument. So we already settled that.
Yes.
But a lot of people would doubt, and I can only speak for teachers, well, I can speak for more than teachers, so I have friends who work in the NHS as well, and a lot of people would doubt, they're just sick of this demonization of people. They're sick of the neoliberal conservative dogma that has basically placed the Western world on its knees at the minute financially, that we've had the experience over the last 30-odd years, and it's the right wing. It's the right wing that has brought us where we are, not the left wing.
No, exactly. That's the laugh. I mean, you'd have to laugh, really, or cry that workers workers are being blamed for a crisis in the capitalist system created by some of the richest people on the planet, working in the richest square mile on the planet in the City of London. Martin, in Belfast, I enjoyed talking to you. Please call back again. Jonathan in Swansea is one of Jeremy Clarkson's defenders, so we'll hear from him after this. Restrictions on NHS workers with HIV could be relaxed. The government's launched a consultation because advisors say current rules are out of step with scientific evidence. A review has found that there's an extremely low risk of the virus being passed to patients. Lisa Power from the Terence Higgins Trust believes it's safe for someone with HIV to carry out almost any procedure.
I think it's safe for someone with HIV to carry out pretty much any medical procedure, provided they are aware of their virus, they're on treatment and they're taking proper precautions.
Now, John Cross, I hope he's not cross, is a crack football writer with the Daily Mirror, one of the best. And frequently, I think, on Talk Sport, though I don't believe I've spoken to him before. But we wanted to talk to him tonight because we wanted a view on the impact of the draw for the forthcoming European Championships, and especially, obviously, with the interest in both the English and, indeed, the Republic of Ireland teams. So he's been good enough to join us at this late hour. John, thanks for that.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, were you, first of all, as an Englishman, were you disappointed in the draw?
Oh, no, on the contrary. I think it's an extremely kind draw. I think it's almost the second best group, if you like. I think the group in an ideal world would have been Group A.
Yeah.
And I think you look at that and you think that all of those games would have been winnable for England. I still think it's been kind for England. I think the hardest game that they will face is a rejuvenated France. I think perhaps the biggest difficulty, as you've referred to earlier, is really the travel. I think that is going to be a factor.
Is that a blunder by the FA?
I think they elected to go early because Krakow was a decision that they made hoping that they'd get Poland. They've certainly ended up in the worst possible scenario, I think, that they could have had. So they took a chance. It's certainly not come off. But I think the decision was to go to Krakow simply because the last time in South Africa they were under sort of lock and key so much. They alienated themselves from the outside world. The players, they didn't get much sympathy for this. Complained about,
yeah,
absolutely, and I think most football fans would sort of say, well, it's not too much of a penalty to pay, really, to lock yourselves away for sort of 5 weeks if it brings home the World Cup. But I don't think necessarily that's all the truth, because sometimes the players, if you're bored, I don't think it probably gets the best out of you. So sure. I think they wanted to be a bit more sociable. And a bit more out there, but it's backfired. I mean, as you've referred to, the round trips are ridiculous. You're talking about 5,000 miles here, so it is far from ideal. So I do think that in itself is a bit of a blunder. I think that it's a group that they should go through on, either as perhaps as winners. I think perhaps more realistically as runners up, because I do think
you're not worried about the Sweden with its long sort of jinx on England. Admittedly, in the friendly recently laid to rest, but not in competitive matches. And you're not worried about the Ukraine with the fanatical support behind them and the home draw?
Well, I think that Ukraine used to be a very good side indeed, and I don't think they're so good now. I don't think they probably would have qualified for this tournament had they not been hosts, and so do so automatically. Shevchenko clearly isn't the player that he was. You're right, the biggest factor is the home fans. They'll find that difficult to overcome in Donetsk. But I do think that's a game they should win. I think that Sweden, we saw a glimpse of that. Admittedly, they weren't at full strength.
And they did come close to an equaliser at the end.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I always have a bit of a laugh about Zlatan Ibrahimovic, their main striker. He's their Wayne Rooney, really. I mean, he's played for all the top clubs in the world and has done very, very well domestically, won all the sort of major titles domestically, but has never particularly done well against English teams and against England. Apart from one occasion against Arsenal in the Champions League. Mm-hmm. And so, therefore, it's become something of a little bit of a standing joke. He's their main man. If you stop Ibrahimovic, I think you stand a great chance against Sweden. I don't think they were quite the force that they were, sort of, 6 to 8 years ago.
When Henrik Larsson played for them, they were a more potent strike force, I can tell you that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also they had Lundberg in midfield. They just had a sort of, a bit more of an all-round team. And now they rely so heavily on Zlatan that I think they are distinctly beatable.
What about the Irish draw, John? How should they be feeling tonight?
Well, Ireland, I always think, do extremely well. They always do above expectations, unlike England, who sort of never fail to disappoint us. The Irish are in reverse, really. Their last sort of World Cup ended, I think, in a penalty shootout, defeated to Spain. And, they did well in that tournament. They always do well. I think they treat it as something of a really exciting place to be. There's not much expectations on their shoulders. The players go out and enjoy themselves. They always, I think, treat it as perhaps their last tournament of their careers, and treat it as such that this is such an opportunity. It's a hard group. I think Spain are the outstanding team in the world at the moment. They're in there. Italy are in a poor place, I think, at the moment.
Yeah,
so
they're beatable this time, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially with Trapattoni as the Irish manager.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's a cracker, isn't it, for Trapattoni?
Yeah.
So he'll have this sort of inside track there. But really, Italy go there with their major forces, is Balotelli, I think, at the moment. And that's, you just don't know what Balotelli sometimes is going to turn up.
Which one will turn up, that's right.
Absolutely.
There's some really mouth-watering ties in the other groups, though, the two strongest groups, isn't there?
Yeah, I look at Group B, and I think Holland will take some stopping. Van Persie, absolutely outstanding for Arsenal this season, this calendar year, in fact. And he's magnificent. I think Denmark will be dangerous, and Portugal too in Group B. But I think the team that most people think can cause Spain the most problems in terms of eventual winners is Germany.
Yeah, my money's been on Germany from the last World Cup. I mean, I think the German team is immense and getting stronger and is extraordinarily young and plays with great flair, unlike many German teams of the past.
Yeah, what I like about them, George, is that I think they've got that experience from the last World Cup. They look very, very strong. I mean, they destroyed England, of course, didn't they?
Yeah.
And they've built on that. They've got a little bit more experience. They have got a little bit of a structure, more of a structure than I think the Spanish in terms of their formation and their style. But then they blend into that. The goals of Podolski, the flair of Götze and Ozil, if you like, they're coming through, and they look such a talented young team. They grew up together, they've emerged together, and I do think they will take some stopping. I've got a sneaky feeling for Germany this time around.
Me too. John Cross told you he was a great writer, good talker too. Daily Mirror football writer John Cross. If you've got a point of view on the draw that was made today, do let us have it. In fact, call us on 08717 223344 if you've got a point of view on any of these issues that we're discussing tonight. You can email us too through the website, free of charge, at talksport.co.uk. And of course you can text us at 50p plus normal charges on 81089. Now, I better take a break for some capitalist messages and a bit of news. Nearly 2/3 of people have avoided disabled people because they don't know how to act around them. The study by BT also found 1/3 see them as a burden on society. My God. James Partridge is from Changing Faces, a charity which gives support and information to people with disfigurements.
It's partly about giving yourself the chance to think about this person normally. People who meet somebody who has a facial disfigurement need to look them in the eye, just as we would anybody else.
Crikey, that's a shocking set of statistics, isn't it? That really took my breath away, I must say. Let me read some of the material that's coming in. Kevin says, I find it strange that the voting has not changed because there is no females on the list. There's something wrong, as females have been nominated previously. Blame the judges. And Mick says, George, did you hear Sarkozy blaming the immigrants for the state of the French economy? He's just getting ready to start scapegoating. And Dan in Aberystwyth says, George, how about Badlands by Bruce Springsteen to play out on? Not really relevant to strikes or the public sector, but it has the immortal line, poor man want to be rich, rich man want to be king, but a king ain't satisfied till he rules everything. Great show as usual. Thanks for that, Dan. Jimmy Kirk in Glasgow says, Mr. Osborne's lineage. I checked his bio online when my oldest son told me he was at the Bilderberg meeting this year. He is the heir to the baronetcy of Tipperary and Waterford. How come he's the British Chancellor of the Exchequer? Well, because these Irish toffs, who were mainly Anglo-Irish toffs, kept their titles, hereditary titles, after Irish independence, because that was a decision of the British, not the Irish. Maria in Cornwall says, George, I've worked with people with learning difficulties for 26 years. I'm 50 and I've had my NHS contract terminated by Tory cutbacks, and I'm now on a private sector contract, having lost everything I worked for. I'm devastated. People like Clarkson and Cameron disgust me with their policies and comments. They have no care for others. Every respect to you and admiration for your honesty. Maria in Cornwall, thank you for that. Alan Welsh says, George, let's face it, Billy Bragg is no Bob Dylan. Clarkson is no philosopher. The gutter of material knowledge causes one to be illusioned. That's way above my head, I'm afraid, Alan. Declan says, did you see Mrs. Cameron's pic in the paper, posing wearing a £600 pair of shoes? Nobody has said a word in protest. All in it together. What a laugh. She should be ashamed. And Alex says, if Clarkson had suggested killing all the bankers, nobody would have cared. A fuss about nothing. Let's hear from the only defender of Clarkson this evening, Jonathan in Swansea. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. Hello, George.
Yes, go ahead.
It's a bit of a storm in a teacup, this whole thing about Clarkson. It distracts from the real issue. What he said was clearly said in jest and is all part of his usual routine of dark and dry humour. And the unions and the ordinary working man would have done themselves a great credit if they had just ignored it. It would have nobody would have cared. No skin off anyone's nose. But instead, they rose to the bait like self-righteous hypocrites with no sense of humour or any degree of self-deprecation.
Well, there's self-deprecation and there's finding it offensive for your children to hear on a 7 o'clock BBC show that their parents should be taken outside and executed in front of them.
And I bet those same parents tell those kids every day how they wish Margaret Thatcher would die and how they'd like to dance on her grave and this and do that to her.
Well, we're talking about millions of people here, so how come you're so knowledgeable about what these people tell their children?
Because they all ring into your show.
Well, all the 3 million?
Yes, all of them. The same old shower of fossilized Stalinists who are always looking to blame someone else for their own misfortunes in life. No sense of humour, just self-righteous bile. and hypocrisy.
Well, you do a good line in self-righteous bile and hypocrisy, as I've heard you on this and many other shows. But just where do you get off calling the dinner ladies or calling the teachers' assistants fossilized Stalinists from the luxury of your bedsit in Swansea, Jonathan? How come you're so knowledgeable about the politics of these teaching assistants and dinner ladies that were on strike in the week?
Well, George, I've never pretended to be anything what I am, so I'm not a hypocrite in that sense. And I wasn't talking specifically, and neither was Clarkson, talking about specifically all dinner ladies, all teaching assistants. He was just talking about those social engineers who've got nothing better to do with their lives than ruin other people's lives with their greed and avarice.
Well, actually, he was not. I've got the words in front of me, and you must know them. He said that the public sector strikers should be taken outside and executed in front of their families. We've got the clip. We've played the clip. He didn't make any comment about social engineers. He said the public sector strikers should be taken outside and executed in front of their families. Let's hear it.
I would take them outside and execute them in front of their families. I mean, how dare they go on strike when they've got these gilt-edged pensions that are going to be guaranteed while the rest of us have to work for a living?
Well, having knocked down one of your straw men, let me explore the second. Greed and avarice. So the teaching assistants, the dinner ladies, the NHS workers are suffering from greed and avarice, and the multi-millionaire tax avoider and smearer of sundry nationalities, countries, and now millions of British citizens, he is innocent of greed and avarice, is he?
Well, if the BBC want to pay Clarkson that money, that's their problem, not Clarkson's. And the fact that he lives on the Isle of Man has nothing to do with it. Good luck to him. He should be allowed to keep the money he's rightfully earned. The problem's with the BBC and all the brainwashed lefties who've been sold a lie by the very same people who claim to be fighting for their interests. The politics of envy preached by people like David Miliband, like Ed Balls, even yourself, who slander the character of Clarkson for the company he keeps, but you lot keep even dodgier company. I'd rather laugh at Clarkson joking about killing someone than being on friendly terms with Arab dictators who go out and actually shoot innocent men, women and children just for expressing disapproval of the illegal governments of the day running those countries.
Now, we know that you don't have much company, Jonathan, because we know that you're a sad man in his underpants, in a bedsit, in Swansea, who sits all day and all night on the telephone to radio stations and presenters like the one who comes after me, whom you relentlessly pursue on the internet and so on. So we'll not get into the subject of company because yours is a fairly sparse field where that is concerned. I want just to ask you one last time. Are you really saying that these dinner ladies, teaching assistants, NHS workers are guilty of greed and avarice?
Only the strikers.
Well, there we have it. From sad Jonathan in Swansea, that the millions of public sector workers trying to resist a government attempt to make them work longer, pay more, and get less are guilty of greed and avarice. You really couldn't make that up unless you knew our friend in Swansea. Now, let's get some more sensible callers. Let's take Patrick in Derry. Go ahead, Patrick.
Good night, George.
Good evening
George,
to you, sir. Yep.
George, I'd like to inform your previous caller, not only did he attack the public sector workers, he also found it funny, and he and he found it great. They make insulting remarks, and this has gone under the radar. Nobody has mentioned this. This was on the same show.
About suicides, yeah.
He also insulted the people who took their own lives on the railways.
Yeah.
Now, if that
in breach of the BBC's regulations, by the way.
If that Welsh fella thinks that's a joke, and what he said about the public sector workers is a joke, they need to see something. And they make an attack on working people, trying to defend their own pensions. George, I'll tell you my case about the private sector.
Yeah.
First of all, there was a report last year that the private sector workers, because they weren't organised, weren't allowed to join unions because the companies wouldn't start them. A lot of people worked unpaid overtime in the year 2011.
Yeah.
Right? And I worked 50 years in the public sector. I never earned enough to pay into a private pension, which, by the way, I'm lucky because it would have been through the floor anyway. Now, after working 50 years, I think it was in a dole once or twice, I get £6,500 a year to live on. And because I was thrifty and saved a few pounds, I pay my own rent and rich out of that. I'm not crying about that. And I say, fair play to the public sector workers for standing up for the agreements, but for wage filling, because see the cabinet, Cameron, Osborne, and by the way, if he's something to do with Tipperary, someone Irish can keep him. They'll all be walking away with thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds in a pension pot.
Hundreds of thousands in their pension pot.
And what they need to remember too, I heard today that they've changed the rules again so that the workers, they'll be getting less money again. Some of these.
Indeed, because of the fiddling of which price index they're going to use.
Exactly. And what Osborne and all the rest of them need to do too, when they're talking about means testing people and this and that and other things, they are public sector workers too. They're getting their wages and their big pensions paid out of the same pot as the dinner ladies.
Yeah, well, I will get, when I'm 65, 23/50ths of my previous salary. So my pension, just from my service in the House of Commons, will be more than £30,000 a year. Nice work if you can get it. The difference between me and them, of course, is I want it for everybody. Let's quickly hear from Neil in Swansea, see if Jonathan in Swansea really speaks for the city. Neil, welcome.
Hiya, George. How are we doing, buddy?
Yes, not bad, sir. Go ahead.
George, I couldn't disagree more with that clown. I don't know what part of Swansea's from, but it's not the part I'm from. I'm 100% in your corner, mate. Basically Cameron and his allies in the gutter Tory press are doing everything to turn the workers against each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Those guys.
And there's always a useful idiot in an attic somewhere with his backside hanging out of his trousers, who's not got two halfpennies to rub together, who can nonetheless be counted on to spend his money phoning a radio show to support the multi-millionaires in their system.
It's awful, George. I mean, these people, they fight them for pensions. They're not affluent people. We've got people working at DVLA, they're on minimum wage. We've got people working at a land registry. They're just trying to get by. Swansea's not an affluent area. My heart goes out to them. And if they think that, people think that if the public sector guys lose money, it's going to help us. It's not. It's not going to gain us a penny, so we should support them, not knock them down. And for me, as a Labour voter, a Labour Party member, I'm disgusted by the silence from the Labour Party in this. Where are they, George? They're supposed to be a party of the working class, for the working class, and they're nowhere to be seen. They should be supporting the strikers 100%.
Well, of course, they weren't supporting them even 1%, Neil. Miliband did rouse himself under fire to make some kind of defence of some of the public sector workers, whilst not supporting the strike. I think it's a serious error, I must say. Neil in Swansea, thanks very much for redressing the balance of the hateful Jonathan in Swansea, from whom I hope I never hear again. I feel soiled having had a conversation with him. Well, surprise, surprise, there appears to be widespread support throughout Britain for reducing the number of immigrants coming into the country. A study by Oxford University says more than two-thirds of us would like to see cuts. Dr. Scott Blinder is from the Migration Observatory at the Oxford University, says there was no correlation between the amount of immigrants in the regions and people's attitudes towards them.
The two areas with the lowest levels of opposition to migration are London, where obviously they're the highest concentration of migrants, and Scotland, which is one of the lowest in terms of migrant concentration.
Indeed, Scotland is one of the only, there was a time when it was the only country in the entire world whose population was falling. They could do with some immigrants, especially those with a bit of capital and a bit of sweat, muscle and ingenuity that they might invest in order to lift the place. Now, I do need from you your nomination for the song that's going to play out the show with. It's got to be something related to the issues that we're dealing with tonight. So let me have those free through the email at talksport.co.uk or for 50p plus sending charges through the text at 81089. Now, I once, tongue-in-cheek, asked the question, are women funny? But that was before I met Kate Smurthwaite, who's very funny indeed. She's a stand-up comedian, she's a stand-up girl, and she's a sharp feminist. So we thought, who better to speak to about the extraordinary situation of the BBC's Sports Personality of the Year contest, which has no women on its shortlist, despite the prowess of British women athletes. Kate, thanks very much for coming back on the show.
My pleasure, George. Nice to speak to you.
Now, were you surprised when you saw this?
Well, honestly, not all that much, no. I mean, I was disappointed, but it's always been a list with not that many women on it. And we kind of know as well that looking through the sort of back records that really, if women want to get on this list, they're much better off in an Olympic year, because the Olympics is one of those few areas of sport where you do get all the men's events corresponding women's events, sort of just as much hype about the women's events as the men's events in most cases. But in a year like this year, where the Olympics is still another year away, it's kind of unsurprising. If you read the back pages of the newspapers, if you read the sports section and try and find the women's sports mentioned, there's very, very little there. It's a pretty widespread problem. And when I saw the stories come up about it and people were talking about it, what amazed me, something I didn't know, maybe you didn't know this as well, George, do you know that it's because all the journalists, all the sports editors who vote, and it includes the sports editors from magazines like Nuts, Zoo, all these lad mags that have some kind of, small little sports section in the back after all the semi-naked ladies and patronising articles, they get to vote. I kind of think maybe the way round is we should turn around and say, right, who does Cosmopolitan want? If you're allowed to vote, surely it's only fair that the women's magazines get a vote too.
Absolutely. You see, that's the reason why we're entitled to be cross about it. If it was the public doing the nominating, then the points you make about the lack of media coverage in a non-Olympic year of women's athletics and women's sport in general would be an explanation for this. But it is professionals in the sporting sections of the media and sports media in general that are making these nominations. They do know of the existence.
But they know, and they're exactly the same people who still give virtually no coverage to these women's sports. I mean, I think it's a sort of cultural shift that we need. We need to stop going, sport, oh, that's for boys. And we need that not only because it's much, much healthier for us as a society to have, real integration and have women involved in these things, but also because we have epidemic levels of childhood obesity and of eating disorders among young girls. And young girls are being fed these messages about you've got to be thin and your bodies are all about how you look and whether you've had surgery and whether you look attractive. And how brilliant would it be to be able to be saying to young girls, actually, here's what your body is about. It's about, can you run, can you jump, can you fight your way to the front, can you be somebody who's brilliantly athletic? That would be such a wonderful message to send through. And I know when you talk to people at the top level, you talk to somebody like the sports minister, they'll say all this, and then you think, well, how about, putting your money where your mouth is? How about actually saying, let's look at the way these things are covered. Let's push the editors to cover more women's sports. Let's say if you're going to cover the men's sports, you need to put something in about the women's sports. Let's look at the sponsorship, at the funding, and say let's make it equal wherever we can. Let's say, hold on, you're getting a tax break for paying money to sponsor a men's sports tournament. Well, you should have to allocate some of that money to support women in sport.
Well, of course, taxpayers are going to be paying many billions of pounds for the forthcoming Olympic Games, women taxpayers as well as men taxpayers. We now have, it's official, the fattest women in Europe and the second fattest men in Europe. We have an epidemic on our hands. We must get people out doing more. And I just think that the BBC have been seriously remiss in this. They ought to have addressed this question, because you'll never get women doing sport unless they see women doing sport, unless they know that sport is out there, how to find it, and can relate to icons and role models in the female sporting roles that should be out there as an example.
Well, I do agree with you, although I also think that it's kind of dangerous to kind of be suggesting that creating these role models is what gets people out, because I certainly know hundreds of guys who watch football every week, and the idea of actually kicking a ball, I mean, they would recoil in horror. You know, as far as they're concerned, they hear the word football, and the first thing they think is 6 pints of lager, please.
I'd give my right arm.
You know what I mean? We've got that sort of connection, and I think actually what we need to do is say, well, that's great, sponsor a big sporting tournament, but let's also have, you know, a community tournament around it. Let's have these sporting heroes coming out into the community and leading a coaching session in a local school, in a local community group, you know, getting youth clubs together and all this kind of stuff. And, I mean, you're talking to somebody, I used to play pretty serious level football myself, and, you know, and I'd still do it, but there's just no funding in it. I just was paying £50 a week, and, you know, and I was only getting a game every other week, and I thought, you know what, I'll just go swimming instead. And I get a bit less exercise, but the truth is it was costing me an arm and a leg. And that's because we go on about, yeah, brilliant, let's get funding for high-level sport. And we don't go, let's make sure it really does filter through to the grassroots level. And these wonderful stadiums we're building for the Olympics, I know they'll have the schools tournament there at some point. But how about having a community exercise program there that's not for your super fit athletes, that's just for people who can come out and go, oh, right, we're all going for a jog round. You know, just these kind of fun, relaxed, no pressure, non-competitive, everybody get involved, see the stadium, work out, build up a bit of a sweat, and you get the message about how good that feels.
What fun it can be. Well, exactly. I'll tell you what, Kate, you'd get a game in my team anytime.
Excellent.
Thanks very much indeed, Kate Smurthwaite. I told you she'd have plenty to say of note. 08717 223344. That's the number to call. 81089 is the number to text at 50 pence plus normal sending charges. You can write to me free through the website at talksport.co.uk. This is George Galloway. This is The Week on TalkSport. We're talking about the public sector, pensions and the strike, and Jeremy Clarkson and the football draw for the European Championships. We're talking about the lack of women on the shortlist for BBC Sportsperson of the Year, and soon we'll be talking to John Le Boutillier about the rise and rise of the newt. I'll be back after the news.
On DAB Digital Radio and 1089 and 1053 AM, The Week with George Galloway on TalkSport.
Congratulations, by the way, to Harry Redknapp and Scott Parker. I actually think that Tottenham are the most attractive team in the Premiership this season. They're the team that I have enjoyed watching most, and I hope that they go on to even greater things. Well, it's the week all right, and what a controversial week it was, but then all the weeks seem to be. Have your say. 08717 223344. It's the number to call me. 81089 to text me, or write to me free of charge by email through the website at talksport.co.uk. Don't forget my Facebook page, and following me on Twitter. I've now got 75,000 followers on Facebook, and more than 50,000 on Twitter, and I talk to them several times a day, directly. You might want to be a part of that. Please do. You're welcome. We've got tons of emails and texts that I haven't been able to get through. We've got 2 legends already on the switchboard, so we better get on.
The Week with George Galloway on Talk Sport.
You know, it tells me on the screen what subject the caller wants to talk about. So when I saw the legendary Carl in Plasto wanted to talk about everything, I kind of half thought we'd give him the next hour, because I, for one, want to hear his views on everything. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, well, let's start with skirts.
Yes.
I don't believe that.
1966, the miniskirt was banned from the House of Parliament, and I'll even tell you the MP that introduced the ban. The late James Dempsey, whose son Brian is a very close friend of mine, and who's been best man at several of my weddings.
Well, what was the name of the wee, I've forgotten her name now, I'm ashamed of myself, the wee Irish MP.
Bernadette.
Bernadette, yes.
Yep.
Didn't she wear a miniskirt?
Well, I think the ban was a brief one.
Yeah.
But I'm just telling you that on this day, in 1966, they were banned.
Yeah, it must have been one particular day. The short skirts were actually encouraged in the 40s to free up materials for uniforms.
Yeah, I think we should go back to the 40s in that respect myself. I very much enjoyed the era of the miniskirt.
Yes, I'm all for that too.
With black tights, quite thick black tights, I like that.
This business about...
And short boots, short ankle boots, I like that, Carl.
Yeah. At the end of
Am I making the SAP prize, Carl?
We can't play sisters are doing it for themselves at the end. We should play sisters are doing it by themselves, you know.
Very good.
Aretha Franklin, I think, and the Eurythmics, you know. And this business, which somebody of comparing public service workers or private service workers subsidise public service workers. Well, public service workers subsidise private service workers, you know. I subsidise people with children. I don't have any children. That's civilization, you know. Somebody should explain it to the Tories, you know. It's what you call society. It's what, you know, it's...
but as Mrs. Thatcher famously opined, there is no such thing as society.
Yeah,
that's what these people truly believe.
This boorish moron, you know, where do they all come from, you know? We've got all these right-wing nutcases that got all this airtime. Kelvin Mackenzie, Richard Littlejohn, that was that strange fella from Channel 4, I forget his name, with the whiskers. He's another right-wing crank, and they all get airtime. That's Jeremy Clarkson. He's a boorish moron, you know. He's not only a disgrace to the broadcasting business, he's a disgrace to the species, you know. You know, abusing striking workers is
you should hear what his ex-wife had to say about him, by the way.
What'd she say about him?
Oof. You'll need to wait for our forthcoming book.
But anyway, he's a great Thatcherite, of course. And Thatcherite, when she said it was the enemy within, she didn't pretend to be joking, you know. And nor did her friend Pinochet, when he actually did take miners out and shoot them, you know.
Yes, indeed.
And another hero of course, would be Winston Churchill, who sent in the troops to shoot at striking miners in Tawny Pandy, you know. We're being treated like the tall puddle. Why don't they just send us out to Australia again? Oh, we've got a better standard of living there, no doubt.
I wouldn't mind. They could send me to Australia any time they like.
Yeah. So anyway, I was thinking about our education system too. Isn't it of mind-boggling simplicity? If you've got money, you get a good education. If you haven't, you don't. They've got it worked out. It's perfect, you know. Yeah, it's a good job we can read and write, George, you know.
Well, indeed, and better than most. Carl, thanks very much indeed for that wonderful call. Here's Terry in Milton Keynes. On the same subject, Terry, go ahead, sir.
Good morning, George.
Good morning to you.
I'd like to make a point that no one seems to have made for weeks regarding the public sector workers.
Tell me.
I mean, public sector workers are treated like pariahs by the private sector. When I retire, I'll have accumulated about 25 years of a pension, and I'm paying about 10% of my salary into a pension scheme. That's the equivalent of 10% on income tax. When I get a pension of about £9,000, the private sector will be saying, well, he's got £9,000 that I haven't. But when it comes to paying rent and council tax, the local council is going to say, well, you can continue paying all your rent, you can continue paying all your council tax because you've got adequate provisions. So the guy next door who hasn't paid a penny into a pot, and he hasn't paid an extra 10% out of his wages, he's going to be no worse off than me because I'm just going to give all my second pension straight to the government.
It's a very, very powerful point, Terry, and I am glad that you made it. That was Terry in Milton Keynes. George, song for the week, If I Could Turn Back Time by Cher. That's from Daphne. Claire from North Wales sends me 3 much-appreciated kisses and says, 3 million callers to your show, George. Wow, that's some listening figures. Was that guy Jonathan from Swansea for real? I'm afraid he was, Claire. Hey, gorgeous George. Sad Jonathan's ignorance is bliss. Maybe so. Did you know hypocrisy is the lowest form of wit? I feel for you, Jeremy Clarkson. Put your foot on the throttle. It's more exhilarating. Dear George, I have never phoned or texted a radio show, but Jonathan from Swansea was a complete disgrace. I value your views, and as an ex-teacher would have walked out on Wednesday. How dare ignorant people like Clarkson criticise the hard-working people of this country. Many thanks from Mark in Bolton. And Jason in Falkirk says, gorgeous, to close your show, how about Creep from Radiohead for our friend Jeremy? It includes the line, I don't belong here. How apt, given his views and where he resides. Very good point. And Gary from Stonehaven says, hi George, I'm 100% behind the strikers, but do you feel Bob Crow and the other union leaders are worthy of their fat salaries and expenses? Well, if there's one man in the entire country who's worthy of his salary, it has to be Bob Crow, who must be the most effective trade union leader for his members, which is what his job is, by the way. He's employed to enhance the wages and conditions of his members. And there can be no union leader in history, in my opinion, who has been more successful in enhancing the status, wages, and conditions of his members. So you're up a gum tree, Mr. Stonehaven, on that one, with me, at least. Here's Damien, another legend, down in Brighton. Go ahead, Damien.
Good evening, George.
Hi.
I'd like to take a slightly different angle on the strikes, if I may.
Yep.
I think that the strikes and the events surrounding them have called into question the trustworthiness of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor.
Uh-huh.
I think both David Cameron and George Osborne have repeatedly claimed that public sector pensions are unsustainable.
Yeah.
But in fact...
statistically just false.
But it's patently false claim, George. The cost of public sector pensions over the coming years is reducing by 25%.
Yeah.
So I would say that it's a form of dishonesty for Mr. Cameron and Mr. Osborne to persistently repeat those claims. I would say also that their trustworthiness is further undermined by their ongoing attempt to dishonour a contract of employment, which they're trying to do without gaining the agreement of the other parties in that contract.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm saying is, I think on balance it would be fair to say that we have a Chancellor and a Prime Minister whose word can't be trusted and who refuse to honour contracts. Now, I wonder, the listeners that are listening to your show this evening, I wonder how they would feel if they had people that they had entered into agreements and contracts with who didn't honour them. But here's my main point, George. We were told by this coalition that their raison d'etre was to reduce the deficit. We're a year and a half in, so I think this would be a good time to review their performance, George. So in a nutshell, we've got unemployment up with over 1 million unemployed young people. We've got tax revenue down.
Growth down.
Growth non-existent down. Benefit payments up. And here's the acid test, George. Government borrowing up. So there can be no other conclusion, I believe, other than the fact that George Osborne's Plan A has patently failed. he decided from the outset, as we've seen by his attack to try and get £3 billion off the public sector workers' pensions to pay for the deficit, that he's not going to go after the tax evaders, he's not going to go after the tax avoiders, he's going to go after the people at the bottom. And I would strongly advise the Liberal Democrats at this time to review their position or as to whether they want to carry on being the Conservatives' lackeys or whether they're going to rapidly move to a policy of confidence by supply.
Well, that's why Damien in Brighton is a legend. Now, let me squeeze in a couple more. Julie in Kent says, do we pay Jeremy Clarkson's wages? I was under the impression that Top Gear made the BBC a lot of money worldwide. The stupid comments he made were just that, stupid. I didn't find them offensive, just idiotic. P.S. Why do you have to mention people being multi-millionaires all the time? You're sounding bitter and jealous, and I really wish you didn't, because I like you a lot. Julie, I'm not remotely... Julie, I earn a very, very great deal of money. I earn the money of 10 public sector workers. 10, maybe more than 10. I'm not at all jealous about other people's wages. What I can't take, Julie, is rich people sneering and smearing people much poorer than themselves, especially when they're tax avoiders and we are paying his wages. Yes, he makes the BBC money, but it was us that paid him the wages to start the job and to build up the following that show Top Gear has got. And it's true that he makes a lot more in the spin-offs, the DVDs and all the rest of it. And if he was paying his taxes here, I would say good luck to him. But of course, he wouldn't be the personality that he is if he didn't work for the BBC in the first place. And he could only work for the BBC in the first place because it exists. And it only exists because we are forced to pay billions of pounds a year in order to create it and to keep it going. So I'm sorry, Julie, I can't agree with you. And I really hope you'll take this from me. I am not remotely jealous of the money that other people earn. I earn plenty. Far more than I ought to need. And I'm in favour of paying tax at a higher rate than I currently pay it. I'm not a hypocrite. I earn a lot, I should pay a lot, because I want to live in a civilised country. If I wanted to live in a country that didn't have a state, that didn't have any services, well, I could move to Somalia, I suppose. As the Christmas party season kicks in, is it kicking in? I haven't been invited to a single Christmas party. Police will be stopping thousands of motorists as they crack down on drink drivers. Anyone caught over the limit could now lose their licence within 90 minutes of being charged. Detective Chief Constable Suzette Davenport is from the Association of Chief Police Officers.
We'll have lots and lots of officers out and about nationally, making sure that we're focusing on drink drive and stopping, educating, but also enforcing the law.
Well, quite right too, if you ask me. Now, a man called Mitt looked like he was running away with the Republican Party's nomination for president to fight Barack Obama at the next US presidential elections. He's an odd sort of fellow, a Mormon, bit of a stuffed shirt, multi-millionaire, and could afford to pay a lot of his own costs. He looked to be running away with it. And then a fella called Cain, not to be confused with McCain, seemed like, even though he was a pizza magnate, that he might be a reasonable challenger. But then he fell at what we might call the Bill Clinton hurdle. He denied, on tape, having had an affair with a woman he now admits he had an affair with. So he's fallen. Perry died on screen, the Texas governor. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And that looked like Mitt had it, if you like, in the bag. But that's before the rise and rise of a man called Newt. So we now have the great heavyweight championship of the Republican Party being fought out between a Newt and a Mitt. Now, who better to take us through, and I think all the way up to the presidential election, who better to take us through these matters than the legend John Le Boutillier, Newsmax columnist and former Republican congressman. John, welcome back to the show, man.
George, it's the highlight of my week when I get called to be a guest on your show, and I kid you not, it's such a thrill.
I really appreciate that, John. I'm on New York radio, WBAI, at 9 a.m. every Wednesday morning, John.
I got to listen next Wednesday.
Yeah,
I'm
it's worth it. Right after Amy Goodman's show. I think mine is better entertainment value, but there you go. I would say that. And I'm speaking in New York in January in a fundraising event for the station, WBAI.org, for those interested.
Finally meet.
We finally have to. Finally have to, John. So it's Newt versus Mitt. Who's going to win that strange contest?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, Mitt is going to lose. Doesn't mean Newt's going to win. It means Mitt is going to lose. The party doesn't want him. The majority of Republican primary voters do not like Mitt Romney. The Republican establishment kind of likes him. Nobody really loves him, except maybe his wife.
Well,
but the voters,
and we hope no one else's wife.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we have to. Well, in the Mormon Church, maybe he can have several wives. I don't know.
Yes.
But he does not connect with voters, especially not conservative Republican voters, and that's been his problem both times he's run for president. And right now, I'm predicting that 5 weeks from Tuesday, or 6 weeks, whatever it is, he will be out of the race effectively. He will lose Iowa. He will lose to Newt Gingrich in Iowa. And because of that, he will then lose the New Hampshire primary. And that'll be the end of Mitt Romney. Now, that does not mean that in the end, Newt Gingrich is going to be the Republican nominee. Newt, at the moment, like the list of guys you just went through, Kaine and Perry and Trump and Bachmann, each of them was the anti-Romney for a moment. Right now, the anti-Romney is Newt Gingrich. So what's going to happen, George, is once Romney is defeated, Gingrich will proclaim himself, I'm the Republican nominee. But I think the next step will be an anti-Newt, because the Republican Party, when they really look at it, will not want Newt Gingrich. He is so flawed with so much baggage, such a disaster waiting to be exposed, that he could lead the Republican Party to the biggest defeat since Barry Goldwater in 1964.
I was just going to say that to you. It could be another Goldwater thrashing. Because, well, just remind the listeners, John, if you would, of just the kind of baggage that Gingrich is carrying.
Well, it's both personal and professional baggage. I mean, on the personal level, we're talking about a guy who's been married 3 times, who, while he was leading the impeachment of Bill Clinton for sex, and lying about sex, he's cheating on wife number 2 with one of his staffers, who is now wife number 3. So there's all that kind of personal hypocrisy baggage. But then there's professional baggage, which is the big mood in America today is against insiders, lobbyists, crony capitalism, making money off being in the government, especially the Tea Party conservatives. They hate that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Newt Gingrich has made over $100 million since leaving office, selling access, cutting deals, lobbying. He is everything his own supporters hate.
Wasn't he also on the payroll of Freddie Mac?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He was on the payroll. He got $1.8 million, in effect, lobbying for Freddie Mac, where he now says Freddie Mac's a terrible thing and all the politicians should be put in jail. who helped it, he was helping it to the tune of $1.8 million. This is the problem, George, with Newt Gingrich. He is the biggest flip-flopper, the biggest two-faced hypocrite that has ever lived. And you will find that every guy who served in Congress with him, including yours truly, will tell you on the record, the last person who ought to be sitting in the Oval Office as president is Newt Gingrich.
Who does that leave?
So
who would be the last man standing, in your view, then, John? Or even what kind of man or woman?
Well, first of all, I think it would be a man, and I think that if what I've just laid out to you happens, I think Romney goes away. He's beaten. Gingrich is the leader for a while. I think somebody else comes in the race. Now that I don't know who. It could be a sitting governor, a former office holder. It'll be some political person who just says, we cannot let this guy be the nominee because we're going to get killed. But I don't have a name for you tonight on who it might be.
No. Well, keep us posted, John. We must make this a regular date. Listen out for my show on WBAI on Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. New York time. And let's meet up, please, when I get to the Big Apple in January. Thanks very much, as always, John Le Boutillier. That's another of the issues we're discussing tonight, the rise and rise of the Newt. Prince William and Kate, as well as Prince Harry, have been appointed official ambassadors for Team GB ahead of next year's Olympics and Paralympics Games. It's hoped they will drum up public support for the team. Olympic rowing legend Sir Matthew Pinsent says he's all for it.
I think it'll mean a lot to the country. And I think actually it'll make the athletes feel as if everyone does care. Right from the people who are going to buy tickets and support them, even on TV or live on the day, right across to the royal family. I think it's brilliant.
Well, that's the least they can do, given the money that we pay them, I should have thought. Now, Gary in Red Hill seems quite a card. Clarkson for a knighthood, he says, in his first text at 50 pence plus normal sending charges, and then in his second text at 50 pence plus normal sending charges, he says, stop crying and smell the coffee. About time these public workers have their pensions clipped. I'm sick of listening to their pathetic argument. Thanks to your beloved Labour Party. He obviously didn't hear the news about my expulsion from the Labour Party 7 years ago, and my whacking that I gave the Labour Party in the general election in 2005. He obviously doesn't know that. Grow up and leave Clarkson alone. Think your brainwashing opinions, think he means opinions, just don't cut the mustard. God bless capitalism. God bless capitalism. Were you protesting outside the U.S. Embassy this afternoon by any chance? No. Please read out if you've got the balls. Regards, Gary in Red Hill. Here's Robbie in Westgate. Robbie?
How are you?
Go ahead, sir.
I was listening to the Prime Minister's chum the other evening. It was obvious he was batting for the Tory party, and they never miss an opportunity to demonise the trade unions. But one wonders why the BBC allowed him the airtime to play politics.
Well, actually, it was scripted by agreement and in advance with the producer.
Well, this is disturbing,
Indeed it is disturbing.
And and those who dismiss Clarkson's remarks as humour are off beam. He knew full well what he was doing, and it had nothing to do with humour. He tried to conceal his offensiveness by pretending he was being humorous, but it won't wash.
I just don't accept it was
Not
a
at
joke.
all.
Not when we know his form.
Look, that's right, and by Christ, he's got plenty of that.
Indeed.
We expect Cameron and his cronies to put the boot into the public sector workers. He's only carrying on where his fellow anti-democratic predecessors, like Thatcher, Major and Churchill, left off. He never tires of telling us that we live in a democracy. Yet when union members exercise their democratic rights, but withholding
democratic rights, having complied entirely to the letter.
To the letter of the law,
Thatcher's anti-union laws.
Yes, and he labels them militants intent on insurrection. He's all for democracy abroad and sends British servicemen to die in its name. Yeah, he would if he could get away with it here. He would deny it to us.
What a good call from Robbie in Westgate-on-Sea. Here's Alan in Glasgow, who was on strike. Alan, go ahead, sir.
Aye, thank you, George. I used to be a public sector worker until Gordon Brown and others took Glasgow's housing out of the public sector, so I'm now in what they call the third sector.
Yes.
However, having been on strike on Wednesday, I'd like to remind Gideon Osborne, David Cameron, and even Mr Miliband, they're public sector employees. And I don't see anybody asking them or them volunteering to give up their pension, to give up their pay, to defer anything to help us out. So,
well, as long as they don't ask them to work on longer, Alan.
Absolutely. Well,
we wouldn't want them to be there a day longer than necessary.
Well, if I had my way, George, although I don't actually vote for anybody, if I had my way, none of them would be there any longer anyway. But, I mean, they're demonising public sector employees. They're talking about the private sector. Everybody's a taxpayer. We're taxpayers as well.
Indeed. Thanks for the call. Here's Stephen in Beckenham. He's against the strikes. We better hear from him. Stephen, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Yeah, hi there. Yeah, I just think I disagree with the strike, because basically I think the pensions and conditions that they're after are just totally unaffordable in the current economic.
No, it's not the ones. They're not after pensions and conditions. They've already got them.
No, but I think they're unsustainable. I mean, in the private sector, of course.
Well, it's a contract, you see. You agree a contract to pay in a given amount, and at a certain age, you'll get a given amount back. Unfortunately, the government has unilaterally broken that contract and told them, and I gave you the example, Stephen, a firefighter will have to work till he's 67. Would you fancy being rescued by a 67-year-old firefighter?
Well, I mean, there's obviously different sort of jobs that firefighters can do. I mean, they don't all necessarily need to be sort of climbing up ladders and jumping in burning buildings. And I just think...
You're very confident about that, more confident than I'd be if I were you.
Yeah, but I just think public sector workers need to sort of, take a look in the sort of, in the current climate we're in and just understand that, what they're after is no longer sustainable.
It's not what they're after. It's what they've got. The government is taking something from them that they've already got.
Yeah, but we're all having to tighten our belts, and I think public sector workers shouldn't be any different.
Well, public sector workers are currently in a pay freeze, and for the next 3 years, they're going to have to accept a 1% pay increase, which is, of course, with inflation at more than 5%, a 4% pay cut. What do you do yourself, Stephen?
I work in the private sector.
You're a wealthy man?
Not particularly. Average sort of salary, mid-30s.
So why are you doing the Tories' dirty work for them in this telephone call?
Yeah, but I feel that my taxes basically are sort of funding, I would say, gold-plated pensions.
Gold-plated pensions of £4,300 for a dinner lady.
Yeah, I mean, but
is that what you call gold-plated?
Yeah, but I would say there's probably over-employment in the public sector anyway.
Over-employment. 800,000 of them have just lost their jobs in the course of the last 12 months, and another 800,000 are about to lose theirs in the private sector directly as a result of the job losses in the public sector. Do you know anything about economics? What's your job, Stephen? What do you work at?
I work in, basically, it's real estate investments.
Real estate investment. What a socially useful occupation that is. Well, Stephen, you need to wake up and smell the coffee, because working in your real estate investment, let me tell you that the dole is right in front of your eyes. You are almost certain to be unemployed in the next year or two, and then perhaps you won't be quite so foolish in the attribution of blame for the problems that we're in. Nothing, as is obvious by now, makes me madder than people without two halfpennies to rub together, in their string vests, or in Jonathan and Swansea's case, in their underpants and their string vests, sticking up for the richest people in the country and seeking to blame some of the poorest people in the country for the problems that the richest people in the country got us into. Here's Tommy in Glasgow. Go on yourself, Tommy.
Assalamu alaikum, John.
Alaikum salam. Go on.
Yeah, well, people like myself, we don't have much need of a pension, when you live in places like Glasgow where the life expectancy is only about 60.
You'll be dead at 53 if you're in the East End.
They can increase the pension to 660 for all I care. We're not going to reach it in certain parts, but I mean, shove your pension, Gideon, we don't need it. And anyway, an interesting fact in Newt Gingrich, right? This guy is the biggest benefits junkie in the whole of the United States of America. At the same time as when he was putting in slash and burn policies and getting the Republicans to cut jobs all a sundry and attacking all the poor little people who are, what did he get over there? Did he just get stamps or whatever? But he was attacking the poor working man. At the same time, this biggest benefits junkie in the United States of America, the subsidy that his state was getting, because, and this is the clear, you can check it out, that this is the fact that when they privatised the profit and they nationalised the debt, that the amount of state funding and money that went into his state from the taxpayer into a private company that builds great big, huge aeroplanes, Boeing, that in his state where they were building these planes, the amount of taxpayer funding, state subsidy went in to fund, as I say, a private company where the debt is kept for itself. And these people, the people who are sitting in the higher echelons of the governments of the world, they're there as the gate masters fronting the banking cartel that sits back in the shadows while they count the coffers. And so we shouldn't be surprised that each time when, and I think what will happen for the Republicans, they'll put up just another patsy, another put-up job, just like John Kerry. So's like shameless Obampot can run riot. I mean, he's the biggest crackpot. I would prefer George Bush and shameless Obampot.
Oh, no, dear God, no. Thanks, Tommy. Here's John in Blackburn, Lancashire. Go ahead, John.
Hello there.
Hello, sir.
Hello, yes. I was wondering, if basically, why is it that you don't support Ron Paul? He's someone that's actually stopping, preventing us from going to war, and also pulling the United States out of Afghanistan and Iraq. He's against the war in Iran. He wants to build ties with the country. But what I don't understand is why you don't seem to support him. Could you explain?
Because he's a far-right libertarian who wants to abolish the government. He doesn't just want to abolish the departments that I would like to see abolished. He thinks that the state should effectively be abolished, that the state has no business educating people's children or keeping people healthy or doing any of the things that I believe a state needs to do. He believes in tooth and claw, untrammeled, unreformed, free market capitalism. And if you think that that has anything to benefit you up in Blackburn in Lancashire, John, you've got another thing coming. Here's David in Essex. Go ahead, David.
Yes, hello, George.
Hi.
I didn't know until I heard your show tonight that Clarkson had made these remarks about why should trains stop after suicides, and I'm absolutely appalled because 16 years ago my adopted son did in fact take his life by jumping in front of a train. Now, the point about it is that the drivers are, by law, they must stop if they hit an object, whatever it might be. But the thing is, he'd been out of work since leaving school at 16. As I say, he died when he was 19. When I and my ex-wife were married, we arranged for him to meet his birth mother, and his birth mother had a heart attack, and so basically the first contact he had with his original family was at the funeral of his birth mother. And I think the combination of being unemployed and this situation with his with his birth mother and possibly even our divorce all sort of came together. But the thing is that after the inquest, we did as a family write to the train driver and had a most wonderful letter back saying, he quite understood and, sort of sympathising with our grief, and he said he'd been on a, sort of counselling course and, was in fact, going back to driving. But
Well, I mean, it's a tragic story, David, and I'm very, very sorry to hear it, especially from you. But I'm going to ask the question here. What kind of a person makes these comments at 7 o'clock on the BBC? What kind of a person has those views? Was that a joke as well? The comments that he made about why should the trains stop for people who've taken their life by throwing themselves in front of a train? Was that a joke as well, I say, to Jonathan in Swansea and his defenders on the emails and the texts here? Was that a joke as well? Is that what we're paying taxes for, to keep the BBC in existence as a platform for these kind of fascistic ravings? Hollywood stars Warren Beatty and Ben Stiller have been honoured at a BAFTA event in Los Angeles. The British Academy handed out 5 awards recognising excellence in entertainment. Actress Helena Bonham Carter was named British Artist of the Year and was also praised for her cool style.
That's very sweet. I'm cool. You see, it's funny, because in England I remember being described as the least cool person, so I don't know. I think I just gave up on trying to be something. I don't know what I am. At the moment I'm kind of slightly tired and trying to be happy.
Now, here's Rodney in Devon. Go ahead, Rodney.
Good morning. Thank you, George. It's a privilege.
Thank you, sir. Good to talk to you.
I'm very ashamed to have to be phoning up about Jeremy Clarkson, because he's another one of these characters like young school children who don't know the difference between silly and funny. And he's what I call an ORC, O-R-C, which in my language stands for old roll of sellotape. And he's an old roll of sellotape because he can't tear himself away from himself. And
yeah,
Quentin Wilson.
I think it's worse than that, Rodney. I think he is a highly politically motivated, extreme right-wing person.
He knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
And the thing is, he used to be on that Top Gear program with a very, very nice and clever man called Quentin Wilson, who had enough of it and dropped out of the show. Quentin Wilson was very good. In any case, all that Jeremy Clarkson does is he presides over a show where a load of anoraks squeeze into a shed and clap overpriced supercars. I can't understand why people stand in a circle and clap cars.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got to fess up here, Rodney. I don't watch the show because he's in it. But my children watch it and enjoy it, much to my horror. But I love cars. And I like high-performance cars. And by the grace of God, I own a lot of cars. And I'm not one of your green, although I drive a hybrid most of the time, I'm not one of your green haters of motor cars. And I'm not jealous at all of Clarkson's money, though I doubt that we should be paying such a high proportion of it. But what I cannot stand, Rodney, is rich people sneering at and smearing poor people. People who earn in a year what they earn in a week.
I know, for a cheap laugh too.
Yeah.
And I think what's equally baffling, to my mind, George, is that he's a big mate of David Cameron.
Indeed.
And more to the point,
Andy Coulson and Rebecca
so is
Wade.
Rebecca Wake a big friend of David Cameron. So it all doesn't say too much about David Cameron, does it?
No, that's a very good point. And as Natalie was just saying to me, sotto voce, it's going to be an interesting Christmas party that Cameron holds this year. Presumably he can't now invite Andy Coulson or Rebecca Wade, or presumably now Jeremy Clarkson.
He'll have to invite Boy George.
Well, you could do worse. Thanks for that, Rodney, in Devon. George, I'd just like to echo your sentiments on Bob Crow. If it wasn't for a strong leader like Bob, the railways would have been just another example of privatisation. Rather than an industry with good conditions, a strong pension fund, a sense of togetherness to stop the private companies exploiting us for profit, perhaps members of other unions should look to Bob for an example of what unions should be. Love the show. Tom in Streatham. And another Tom asks, have you ever met Clarkson? I have not. And if I saw him bearing down on me, I'm afraid I'd walk off in the other direction. Tom in Bridlington, that was. Dan in Aber something, it's been cut off, says, Working Class Hero by John Lennon, or the cover of the same song by Green Day. And Tricky Daz says, how about finishing the show with Big Mouth Strikes Again for Jeremy Clarkson? Or for George Osborne, Dude, how about Looks Like a Lady by Aerosmith? I don't know. He doesn't look like a lady. He looks like a schoolboy to me. Now, Alex in Stoke asks who we owe all this money to, which is a very good subject I think we should return to, Natalie. Just what is this indebtedness that we have, and to whom? Ian in Belgium at the moment, presumably not an immigrant, says, I think that Jeremy was speaking for the people, not just the public sector, and with real passion. And although I work in the private sector as a truck driver with no pension, you get the message, yeah? Somebody who works as a truck driver in Belgium doesn't want immigrants to benefit from pensions. How's that for a non sequitur? And although he doesn't have a pension, he wants the public sector workers to lose theirs. That sums up the kind of false consciousness as we post-Marxists describe it. I don't include, of course, the next man up, because he ain't no Marxist, but he is the thinking man's overnight radio star. And whatever Jonathan in Swansea in his vest and pants thinks, I'll be listening to him, and so should you. What have you got for us, Matt?
Well, this is my final show of the year, so Merry Christmas to you, because this...
Oh, really? I heard you say that last week. You're going away.
I'm off to New York for a bit with a pal of mine.
Excellent.
Very excited.
Have a nice time.
So I'll be back in January, but Merry Christmas for now. We'll be continuing the discussion about the strikes and about public sector pensions, and I mean, what amazes me is that people fall so easy for this divide and rule tactic.
Oh, easily, yeah.
Yes, it's right that low-paid staff in the private sector don't have decent pensions, but that's because of unscrupulous capitalist employees who don't look after their staff properly.
Exactly.
Not because of dinner ladies and doctors and teachers. And I find it remarkable that people fall so easily for this. Well, the weak argument.
If it's immigrants or it's public sector workers, or in fact, the people that phone up here, you can tell they've got nothing themselves, but they're kicking another group of workers.
It's unbelievable. As long as that mentality exists, and it's the mentality that got Margaret Thatcher elected 3 times, it's the mentality that returned the Tories to office. And, the thing is, even though they're in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, they've still got 2 million more votes than Gordon Brown did. The fact is they were significantly more popular than the result suggested. Anyway, we'll talk about the economy and the autumn statement, and also a story. I'll be talking to someone from PETA at 2 o'clock. That thousands of stray cats and dogs have been slaughtered in the Ukraine in a bid to tidy up the streets for Euro 2012. So we'll be discussing that as well.
Well, stay up overnight for Matt Ford. This is the letter of the week from Fraser White in Burnham-on-Sea, Somerset, who took the trouble to post this. Dear George, I thought last Friday's show was pretty dismal. At 23:20, I gave up and switched off, hoping things will improve. F.A. White. Well, I hope you think they did improve, Fraser. Thanks for the fan mail.